Nick Kristof has always embodied the spirit of Peter Kihss, except that Peter Kihss' domain was New York City, while Nick's has been the planet Earth. He's traveled to 150 countries, 150 countries. I didn't know there were 150 countries. All 50 American states. His dispatches, whether as a reporter or a columnist, display an exceptional sensitivity to human misery, poverty, and pain, the hunger and genocide in Darfur, children forced into prostitution in Cambodia, India, and the United States, the opioid crisis in rural America. He has inspired and mentored many young journalists, and since 2006, he's been taking young college students and high school teachers to various African countries as the reward in an essay contest sponsored by the Times. Along the way, he won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one of which he shared with his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn. Nick will talk about his memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, which chronicles his dispatches from Tiananmen Square, the Yemeni Civil War, the Darfur genocide in Sudan, and many other spots where human rights and the vulnerable have been endangered. Yet despite all the tragedies and calamities he's documented, Nick has not despaired. As he wrote in last Sunday's opinion section, some people see my career covering massacres and oppression and assume that I must be dour and infused with misery, a journalistic Eeyore. Not so. Journalism is an act of hope. Why else would reporters rush toward gunfire, visit COVID wards, or wade into riots to interview arsonists? We do all this because we believe that better outcomes are possible if we just get people to understand more clearly what's going on. Nick, come up, please. I want to give you the award. Yeah. Oh, there it is. Always prepared. Oh, the medallion came on. Thank you, and I'm truly
I certainly don't need to introduce you, since everyone, especially in this room, who doesn't know you has to have been living under a rock for some time, at least according to some of the tales in your remarkable must-read memoir. There it is, available, I believe, on Exit for a fee, and certainly in your local bookstore or Amazon. Anyway, they must have known about that because they must have found you even sheltering, at least for a moment, from the latest war, revolution, or human catastrophe under that rock that you might have been found under if they didn't know who you were. At any rate, before we get into your origin story, I'd like to jump to the end in a way. You know, I'm an historian by education. I'm reluctant to engage in what-ifs, but I'd be interested in your discussing a bit the divergence, perhaps increasingly these days, between commentary and reportage. In the course of your remarkable career, you've championed any number of causes, changed so many millions of lives on multiple continents, but what if the Times hadn't anointed you as a columnist, but simply allowed you to roam wherever you'd like as a correspondent? What might you have done differently, and what might you advise today's reporters to do in circumstance like that?
Thanks. And is this working? Yeah, I think it is working, right? And first of all, I really am honored. So I did not know Peter at the Times, but he was a legend who just infused the Metro desk and especially the whole paper really with this sense of commitment, accuracy, integrity, and the stories of daring do and him, filing incredibly rapidly and accurately have been, handed on generation after generation. So I'm really honored to receive this. So in terms of this question of reporting versus opinion, I'm in this sort of strange position of being this opinion guy, this opinion columnist, who's kind of skeptical of opinion journalism. And I really do think that the most important thing that journalists do, including opinion people, is the reporting part of it. And it's not stirring the pot, but it's adding to the pot. And I do think when that is done, then opinion journalism can be really useful, because we can not only present new information, but we can do it in a way that provides a context and, a thoughtful idea about where to take it. But I think the tendency often has been, you see it particularly in cable TV, but not just, where opinion journalism becomes about shouting one's own view and not really adding new perspectives, but it's about preaching to one's base. And I do not find that terribly useful, frankly. I think, and I have to say that I think my most important opinion columns have basically been about the reporting. So when I was writing about the Darfur genocide, the opinion was pretty boring. I mean, the opinion was genocide is a bad thing, and that's not a very interesting idea. But I think what made those columns work, and likewise the sex trafficking columns and various other things, was really the reporting. And so I think if I had been, if I had not gotten the column, I think I would have ended up doing sort of fairly similar things if I had the freedom to do it. And I probably would have been, reined in by editors saying, "Oh, you're skating pretty close to what those opinion people do." But I do fundamentally believe that what is important about journalism is the reporting part.
Right, but so let's bring it up to the present day. Some of these things would really be lighting a fire, or lighting a match under a blazing inferno, potentially. So what if you today were to label what's going on in Gaza a genocide, which in many respects it probably is? How would that work? Would you feel comfortable doing something like that today, given the charged atmosphere that it's really that we're seeing on college campuses and the political scenario and so on?
So, I mean, even in my column where I do have license to report on opinions, I have not used the word genocide. I've been very critical of Israeli conduct in Gaza and critical of the Biden administration's unconditional transfer of weapons to be used in Gaza. But to me, at least the choice of the word genocide is not particularly helpful. And again, I think it's the reporting about the number of 2,000-pound bombs being transferred and the impact of those bombs and what happens to neighborhoods, this kind of thing. And, talking to people in Gaza any way one can through WhatsApp or whatever, and trying to convey what is happening there that is more important. I mean, I do have to say that I'm a little bit conflicted on these issues because I've always, and I had to wrestle with this a little bit in writing the book, because I've always believed that reporting should have a moral purpose. One reason why I went into journalism was in the aftermath of Watergate, that journalism does serve a real purpose. And I felt that when I was covering Tiananmen in China, and I saw a modern army mow people down. I wanted to fight back at massacres with my keyboard. But yet, I think that there's a danger of taking that too far, and I think some journalists today do try to take that too far and want, every piece that is written to, slam down a moral argument. And I think it's not a binary question, but there's a spectrum. And where exactly on that spectrum we put ourselves is going to be different, whether we're in opinion or whether we're on the news side. But I think it is possible to serve as a journalist, to feel that you are serving a cause larger than yourself and some kind of public purpose without using the word genocide at every turn and without, going over the top.
Well, so when Joe Kahn was here last month, sitting in that very chair, in fact, he blamed the journalism schools for fostering that kind of an atmosphere. So, for instance, if if we see 500,000 people dying of famine in Gaza, does that then become genocide? Or what should journalism schools be teaching people as well in reporting on something like that?
So my take is that it's not exactly the journalism schools as such, but that there is a real generational gap within journalism, and that a lot of it is because newsrooms now have a lot of people who are not traditional journalists. They're not reporters or photographers, but they are working on your search engine optimization. They're working on coding. They're doing audio and video and 1,000 other things, and doing incredibly important work. But they do not necessarily emerge from, covering city council meetings and having to face city council members the next day. And again, I think it's it's important for journalists, whether they're covering a city council or a presidential race, to convey the truth as they understand it, but it has to be done without, having a cudgel, whether you're covering city council or the White House. And pulling that off, I think, is hard. So I don't think it's so much the journalism schools as such. I think it's partly the range of people who now work in newsrooms, and like me, they deeply believe in having a moral purpose in journalism, but from my point of view, they want to take it too far. I mean, like they don't want to run a Tom Cotton op-ed, for example, because they think it's wrong, dangerous, unhelpful. I believe, op-ed pages should have a broad range.
So let's step back and see how you got here. What made you become a journalist, and not say a lawyer? You got you through your roads in law at Oxford. You were all set. You could have gone into a white shoe law firm. You could have made, a ton of money, and also done good things along the way, perhaps. What made you choose journalism rather than some other law or some other practice?
I think probably the same reasons that a lot of us here became journalists. I mean, it really is pretty incredible that we managed to figure out how to get paid for interviewing interesting people and go interesting places. And don't tell my editors that, but I think it is it is just an amazing profession. Somebody the other day was describing the book as a love letter to journalism, and I just think it's incredible what one has been able to do. And there was also that element of moral purpose, I think. I don't think I would have felt terribly fulfilled as a corporate lawyer. I did see with Watergate the power of journalism, and when I was studying law, I happened to make a trip through the Middle East, and I was paying my travel by freelancing of articles. And I went to Hama in Syria in 1982. Hama was a brutal massacre in which nobody really knows, but maybe 20,000 people were killed. And again, you see a government slaughter people, and you think, how does one address that? And maybe some people respond to that by becoming an aid worker. My view is one can address that by raising the cost to government of massacring people or committing genocide. And one way of doing that is, again, with our laptops, with our cameras.
Our mutual friend, John Kiffner, once told me, he said, he stopped his car on the fringe of a rice paddy in central Java at dawn, and was watching the sun rise over it. And he got out of his car and he said, I'm not going to tell anybody in New York, but they're paying me to do this. So anyway, you're absolutely right. So I have a sense it was Tiananmen Square that really changed you in many respects. Joe Kahn, in fact, confessed he too was very much changed by China. How did that experience change you beyond being able, of course, to work with your wife on a major story?
It taught me a lot of things. One is it was impossible during the Tiananmen student democracy movement not to just have your heart be moved by kids who were risking their careers and risking their lives to try to achieve a more democratic government. And I think that also created problems in our journalism, and that we thought that the underdog might actually win. We kind of believed a little bit too much the rhetoric that, the power of the people. And it turns out that when principals encounter machine guns, typically the machine guns will triumph, at least in the short run. I think also one of the things I learned was that my sources in the Chinese government were disproportional among the reformers. And so I didn't, appreciate how many hardliners there were who were absolutely ready to massacre protesters. Then after the massacre, I was on Tiananmen Square, so I knew what had happened. I had an idea about how many people had been killed. And then there were all kinds of rumors going around in Beijing that made their way into a lot of papers that were wild exaggerations. And, the tens of thousands of people had been killed. that Tiananmen Square was knee-deep in blood, this kind of thing. And one of the things I learned from that is, victims lie too. And that inevitably, we tend to find victims credible and distrust perpetrators of massacres. And we should have that distrust of the perpetrators, but we also have to be skeptical of victims. And that was one of the lessons I absorbed. I think it also, though, it affected me in another way, in that I think much of my career has been about skating along the edge of what is appropriate for a journalist. It's a little easier as a columnist. But I think that began in China after watching the government massacre people. And one thing that I did, which I wrote about, as you know, is there was a student who had helped us cover Tiananmen, a 19-year-old kid named Liu Xiang. He got in trouble for helping us. He ended up in prison. He escaped from prison. Then he came to Beijing and secretly asked for help in fleeing the country. One pretty basic rule of journalism, of course, is that you don't help escaped felons flee the country. On the other hand, here's a 19-year-old kid who, if we didn't help him, was at some point going to get caught. Terrible things would have happened to him. And my wife and I just agonized over our responsibilities to the Times.
So don't tell them how you wrote. Let them read the book. Make them read the book to find out.
Okay. To be continued in the book.
Okay. So I love some of your comments. So let me just run down some of the comments in your book. One was, American liberals are rightly skeptical of military interventions. Why does it just have to be American liberals? And why isn't the GOP just being a trifle hypocritical by its determinedly pro-Israel stance, for instance? Why does it have to be liberals, do you single out in that phrase?
Just because it's traditionally been liberals who have been skeptical of military interventions and conservatives, more sympathetic. I was thinking of Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera. So
But should it not be a feeling that across the political spectrum?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we should be, the context there is that we should be skeptical of military interventions, but think about it on kind of an ad hoc basis. There are some interventions that have really worked really well. I think we should have intervened in Rwanda in 1994, for example. I think intervening in Kosovo was absolutely the right thing to do. Britain's intervention in Sierra Leone, turned the course of meanwhile, Iraq was a huge catastrophe. So basically what I was trying to convey is it's complicated, and beware of broad ideological pronouncements. Okay,
so here's another one. You never fully recover from watching any army turn weapons of war on its own people. Isn't that just what Donald Trump has threatened innumerable times to do, even on the American people?
Slightly more subtly than what happened at Tiananmen or elsewhere, but only slightly.
Yeah, only slightly,
yeah.
Right. So how would you react to something like that as a columnist?
Well, so I think, it's a lot easier for columnists. I think basically, as columnists, we do have the freedom to call out Trump when he talks about things like that.
How should a journalist react? How should a New York Times journalist react?
The journalist's problem, I think, is more complicated. I think that in 2016, we erred because we followed, a traditional approach where, put it this way, I think that in journalism, we try to promote fairness and also truth. And often when you are fair and quote, people on each side and let readers sort it out, often that advances truth. I think sometimes that does not. And I think of the Joe McCarthy period where it just did not work, to quote Joe McCarthy and some guy who was accusing him of being a communist. The public didn't understand. Civil rights movement, the same. I think Vietnam, there's something likewise it did not work. I think that Donald Trump in 2016, likewise, it just did not work, to quote Trump at one level and then Hillary Clinton on the other. I think the public didn't get what every reporter covering the presidential race did, which was that, Hillary Clinton was sort of about typical for a presidential candidate in terms of deceptiveness, if you will. Trump was off the charts. He was like nobody else. And I don't think we conveyed that adequately to readers. I think we should be, when we see that the truth is not getting through, I think we need to be more blunt, do more reporting, and that that will, to some degree, sacrifice trust for news organizations from the right. But I think truth is our paramount responsibility.
Civilization can unravel with frightening speed. Is this what we're catapulting toward in America today?
So I worry about that, and one thing that I think a bunch of people in this room have seen is how you get a society that is kind of working, and then for whatever reason, sometimes it's ethnic tension, sometimes it's a political leader, then it just comes apart, and you get acts of violence that are horrific. Thomas Hobbes' writings became much more real to me when I covered some of these societies, Indonesia, Myanmar, and others that just unraveled and people turned on each other. And I do worry about that in the context of the U.S. There's a lot of talk about how the U.S. may become less democratic, and I think that is one element of it. But another thing I worry about is political violence. And we are so polarized that you can easily imagine some act of political violence, some assassination of some right-wing or left-wing figure being done, and then a jury having one or two members who will just refuse to convict, creating a sense of impunity in ways that incentivize more acts of violence like that. And that's one thing I worry a lot about.
I see Tony about to go for the microphone, but let me ask you one more question. Pessimism is as bad for your cardiovascular health as smoking 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes a day. It seems, though, like a lot of the time you are a pessimist. How is your health?
Now, I don't think of myself as a pessimist at all. I've seen a few too many massacres to be an optimist exactly. But when people first meet me, they sort of expect this, gloomy guy who's going to corner them and wag his finger and tell them about genocide of the Rohingya or female genital mutilation or whatever it may be. And in fact, the truth is that I think the antidote is twofold. One, that over my career, I really have seen this backdrop of moral and material progress. And when I was a kid, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate. Now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. That's transformative. When I was born, 20% of kids died before the age of 5. Now we're down to 3.7%. This year we'll set a new record low in the 300,000-year history of humanity for the risk of a kid dying by the age of 5. Those are really important gains. And so part of it is those, that trajectory. And the other is just, and I think a lot of you know this as well, that when you are out covering crises, then you may write about the warlord who is killing people, raping people, torturing people, but side by side with the worst of humanity, you just invariably find the best. And we are not tested in this country to the same degree because these things aren't happening right now. But when you are in Eastern Congo or Darfur or wherever, it turns out that when we are tested, we are capable of just amazing courage and decency and strength. And so I managed to come back sometimes from, Eastern Congo, feeling a little bit better about humanity, despite all the terrible things that are going on. Because when we are tested, people manage to come through sometimes.
And you do get back, which is sometimes quite a miracle from this book. Okay, it's time to go to the videotape, as it were, and we have our first question over there.
Yeah, hi, Jerry Eskenazi. Nick, did you find that the rise of social media and cable has affected the way columnists such as yourselves work today? Do you have much more to explain? Are there problems inherent in that?
So, boy, I just have very ambivalent feelings about social media. On the one hand, I think one of the risks is that journalists have kind of figured out that there is an advantage to building their own brand. There's a commercial benefit. You can give, speeches. You can parlay that into television gigs. You can write books. And basically, if you want to have a brand, then it's important to be predictable and to cater to a particular ideological niche. Not always, obviously, but often. And I think social media very much encourages that kind of process of pushing journalists, especially opinion people, into particular ideological niches in ways that just leave us reinforcing people's prejudices rather than making them question themselves. And I think there's no doubt also that social media nurtures an undercurrent of extremism and polarization that is unhealthy for democracy. On the other hand, it has created some real accountability and checks and balances. There's a lot of meanness and unfairness and just idiocy on social media. But, Black Twitter, I think, actually was fairly useful in bringing new voices to the fore that weren't getting attention and new issues to the fore. And internationally, like when reporters couldn't get into Syria, the ability, or Iran, a more recent example, the fact that people in Iran were able to use social media to document the government arresting, imprisoning, killing people was a really important part of the picture that we were not able to cover adequately. So I just, half the time I roll my eyes and think I'm never going to get on Twitter again. And then often I actually drift back and look at it, but don't tell anybody.
And some of us can't because Elon Musk banned them from it. So, oh yeah. Who's next? Wait.
Hi, Nick. Great to see you.
Okay. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, hi.
Okay.
You ran for office. You ran for governor of Oregon. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because it seems as though if you were going to become the governor, it's a whole different job. It's an administrative job. It's to me, it seems like it would be a nightmare, perfectly honest. So what was your thought process? What was going through your mind to make that decision?
Yeah, so it may have been a certain amount of delusional thinking there. But so essentially, so my previous book had been about the crisis in my own hometown in rural Oregon. And this was an area that was dependent on agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing. Those jobs went away. Meth arrived, and at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus have died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. It's just been catastrophic to see what has happened. And, I was also just really frustrated by what was happening in Oregon. We're full of these great liberal values, but our outcomes, there's this incredible gulf between our values and our outcomes on homelessness, on crime, on education, et cetera. And so, and I thought that there was a weak field, and so that was why some people had reached out to me at the time. And I also thought that if a reformist governor were elected, that person would actually have something of a mandate to really bring about changes. And so, so I made that leap. Part of the calculation I was deciding that was that there were a lot of things that I didn't, I didn't know the county commissioners and state legislators around the state. I knew nothing about, state finance and campaign finance. There were all kinds of missing areas that I should have known. But what I kept hearing from people was that really what was most necessary was somebody to advance a vision for the state and then bring people along toward that vision, and that it was a kind of a communications need as much as an administrative one for the state. And that was an argument that I found somewhat persuasive. I'm not sure how true that was. And I mean, it was sort of funny that when I did run, my team and I thought, well, okay, I may not know campaign finance or whatever, but okay, the one thing Kristof will be able to do really well is meet the press and engage with the reporters. And it turned out to be one thing I was really disastrous at. And you know what the problem was? I answered people's questions. And my team was like aghast. And I'd be asked some difficult question, and
you can motivate them. And you can motivate them. And you can. It's motivation, isn't it? Isn't motivation a large part of this?
Being in office.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I think that is the case.
Yeah. Who's next?
Me.
Okay.
Hi, it's fascinating to hear you talk, but I'm raising a different question. It's the Peter Kihss Award that you won. And I am fascinated by your mentoring of so many journalists in your travels around the world. I wonder if you could take a moment at this lunch to go into that a bit, how you do it. I'm fascinated by it. Anything you can tell us.
And Linda, of course, has mentored, I mean, when she was running the clerk program at the New York Times, those clerks have now peopled journalism at the New York Times and around the field. So you provided a model for that. So I benefited very much from the mentoring of other editors and writers when I was a young reporter. And so, tried to explore how I could further that. And the two ways that I found it possible to do that to some degree were hiring really good assistants as a columnist, and then really encouraging them and supporting them as they began to write. And James Reston was really the pioneer of that in the Washington Bureau. And so I was just kind of copying his model. And the other was, when I was writing about Darfur, it was just so frustrating. And hundreds of thousands of people are being slaughtered. And it just felt like my columns were just disappearing without a ripple. So I was trying everything I could to try to, what can I do to engage people? And that's really when I began leaping into video and social media and a whole bunch of approaches. But one was I decided, hey, maybe I can have this contest to take a student with me on a reporting trip to Darfur. And then there'll be a competition which will arouse interest. And then the student will write about Darfur and other students will be interested. And so I proposed this internally in the New York Times, and it went to the legal department. And the legal department said, oh, so you want to take a student into a war zone? So I then revised the plan to take a student with me to the developing world. And on that first trip, we kind of encircled Darfur without quite going into it. We did manage to get held up at gunpoint twice in the course of that first trip. But it has been, it's a reminder of just how many incredibly talented young people there are who study journalism, who want to be journalists, even though the business model for what we do is quite uncertain. And it has been just a privilege every year to take a student and on a trip abroad and guide them to to cover issues, and they bring something important to the table. They can relate to young people often in a way that I can't. They understand, they have concerns, that viewpoints, perspectives that I might not. And so I think it has been good for the Times. I think it's been great for them. They've done amazing things. It's now been 18 years since I started it. It's been just a wonderful process to do that.
Hi, I got a question for you over here. I just returned from Oregon myself. I got relatives live there, Willamette County, Tillamook County. New York Times is so far from their reference. When I talked about stories around the Times, it was like I was talking something in another century to them. Now I can see your journalism, you traveled around the world, but you're working for one of the most elite media organizations in our time. Does that frustrate you? And is that what drove you to get into the political sphere in Oregon? Because not only are they thousands of miles away from us, but the people that you grew up with who had these tragic lives were not touched by government or social programs. How, as a journalist, did you approach this, and how do you see yourself now in that, wrestling that paradox?
Well, also, is your column published in local newspapers in other parts of this country or the world, for that matter?
So my column used to be published in the Oregonian, but now, of course, budget cutting, they don't take the New York Times News Service anymore. I mean, the Oregonian was once a great paper. It's now a shadow of itself. So I think that one benefit of now being out in the wilds of Oregon, in a really conservative rural part, is that my neighbors have, about 2/3 of them voted for Donald Trump. Many people I deeply cared about would tell me that COVID vaccines were dangerous, or that this was all a plot by Bill Gates to whatever, make them sterile or make money somehow. One of my best friends there packs a gun on his hip, more or less 24/7 as far as I can figure out. But these people are not caricatures. These are people I know, have known forever, care about. I got a text this morning from an old friend who, he started using drugs when he was 12. He's been in and out of problems before that. A year ago, he was selling fentanyl out of the back of his car and using it. And these people, my friends, sometimes exasperate me. I often exasperate them. But we're friends, and I have to figure out how to talk to them. I have to understand what might move them. And that does, I think, shape my column writing. I mean, one of the things that I came to understand is the importance of what social psychologists call complexifying an issue, so that if you're talking about gun policy, for example, you don't have a conversation about the Second Amendment. You don't have a conversation about gun control or whatever. You have a conversation about some area at the margin. So you say, okay, if you have a felony conviction, you can't buy a firearm. Well, what about somebody who's had a violent misdemeanor conviction in the last 3 years? Should they also be barred from having a firearm? And, people may or may not agree with me, but they're willing to have that conversation. Or that you, right now in Oregon, to buy a handgun, you have to be 18. In Wyoming, one of the most pro-gun states there is 21. Should we maybe make it 21? And again, people are willing to engage on that, and then they push me back on, the things that they care about, that they think they just can't believe liberals, won't allow something. And I do find it really useful. It's a little like being a foreign correspondent sometimes in a very different society, but with the difference that, these are people that I care a lot about. I think they care about me. They can't believe I'm so misguided, but they hope that I'll finally come to.
Yeah, time for one last question.
One more, yes.
From Mike Candell, the great Mike Candell.
If you were a student at Columbia right now, what would you be doing and saying?
So, if I were writing in the Daily Spectator or whatever, I was so glad students cared about the world and wanted to engage in the world and felt empathy and compassion for people dying in Gaza needlessly. And so I really admired that engagement. I thought that the campus protests at Columbia and on a lot of campuses were, though, not helpful to Gazans. And I think the metric of progressivism should be progress. Good intentions are not enough. And what matters is outcomes. And it was not obvious to me that the campus protests at Columbia or at a lot of other campuses overall had useful outcomes. And in contrast, it seemed to me that very often the upshot was that instead of talking about kids starving to death in Gaza, we were talking about what to do with tent encampments at Columbia or Yale or elsewhere. That it diverted rather than focused the attention. And I thought there was also, on some campuses, a strain of anti-Semitism that undermined and undermined the legitimacy. So that was my take on that. I think protests can be a really important tool, but I think it's also really important to ensure that they advance some cause and don't risk setting it back. And maybe that's because I covered a lot of protests that actually did result in setbacks.
Well, no setbacks here. And in fact, we should be chasing hope. And this is the book. And this is the author. And we thank you very much. And everybody go out and buy it. If you can't get it at the door, you can get it immediately on Kindle. And you'll be able to download it and read it beginning this afternoon or this evening, which you should do, everyone. So, thank you very much, Nick.
So much.
And congratulations on the Peter Kihss Award.